Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the day. Susan Sarver is Director of Workforce Planning and Development with the Buffett Institute for Early Childhood. We're very fortunate to have her today. Her research has been on studying rural families living in poverty and continuity between parents and teachers as they contemplate how their young learners will enter school. This whole topic should be very interesting to most of us. We did the future of education for higher education a little while ago, but this one is crucial to our continuing existence in the education field and for young people. Most schools in Nebraska are serving 3- and 4-year-olds in school-sponsored or parent pay programs. And Susan may address that later, but the numbers would probably surprise us at how many school districts are offering such programs. It's been a quiet revolution, but it's been a really good revolution. Susan provided leadership for under programs at early childhood education at UNL in the College of Education and Human Sciences. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Washington and Lee University in Virginia, and a master's and PhD in early childhood and family development from the University of Georgia. I think we're in for a very special treat. Susan, I introduce Susan Sarver.
Thanks so much, Larry. I hope I can live up to that introduction there. Pleasure to be here today. I'm going to do just a little bit of background for you. I see my slides are in there somewhere. I have to pull them up. Yeah, technology. I am still tenured faculty in Child, Youth, and Family Studies in the college. And about 9 years ago, my wonderful dean, Marjorie Kostelnik, worked out a memorandum with Sam Meisel's, the founding executive director of the Buffett Institute, and I got to go work for the Buffett Institute. And there now I'm the director of Workforce Planning and Development, which is this great big long title, and everybody says, well, what do you do? And I get lots of emails about human resources, because people search the web and they go, oh, you're hiring. You do all the human relations stuff and, you know, all the employers. And I'm like, no, not at all. Nothing like that. And finally, my first year there, I talked to Sam, and I'm like, okay, what am I supposed to do, Sam? And he said, there's a workforce problem, fix it. And I said, well, what should I be reading and doing? And he said, I hired you because you know. I went, okay, thanks. So I spent several years trying to figure out what I was doing and what needed to happen. And finally, this past couple of years, I've actually been able to get it down to that elevator speech. My job is to make sure early childhood teachers can do their job so that they can deliver quality in all the places that they are. My job is to build on their strengths and what's in the system and to get barriers out of their way. So I don't work directly with teachers. I work with the people who tend to be working with teachers. So I spend a lot of time with higher education institutions. I spend a lot of time with NDE and DHHS and other folks who are doing things in the system that impact those teachers that are working with young kids. It's only taken me 9 years to get that down. Okay, so what I want to do today, just a little bit, is just give you a teeny bit about the Institute, if you aren't familiar with the Institute, and then just a little background in early childhood so you know why this is so important. Okay. The Institute has been around for 10 years now. We just released our 10-year report. The vision is Nebraska will be the best place in the nation to be a baby, which is one of those really great, inspiring visions that we all seem to resonate with. This lovely blue-eyed darling is actually Sam's granddaughter. She's now, I think, 12. But Lucy is one of our favorites in terms of pictures and posters that we like to have. The Institute started with what we call 2 signature programs. One is to close the opportunity gap. So we know there's families and children that are placed at risk because of certain circumstances. They may be born in poverty. They may be born in a certain zip code. They may be people of color. And that often means they don't have the same opportunities of others. So one of the things we want to do is close that gap that's there. We used to talk about it as the achievement gap. but that's very deficit-oriented. So we're really talking about the opportunity gap and access to opportunities. My area is elevating the early childhood workforce. And the idea behind this is that we have lots of people out there working with young children, and we see birth through grade 3 is our area of early childhood, so birth up to about age 8. And all of those people working with kids are the early childhood workforce. And the goal is to raise up what they're doing, and so that people see them as professionals and how important it is that they're doing this work. This is just a couple of numbers to kind of get us oriented a little bit here from Nebraska. These are from Voices for Children, 2021 numbers. We have about 1.9 million people in Nebraska, and 509,000 of them are children. Now that's under the age of 18. Now when you go down, you'll see that there's a good portion of those who are under 5, and another quarter who are 5 to 9. How many have grandkids in that age range? Or just out of that age range? Okay, we've got some great grandkids. Okay, how many have children? Okay, we have a lot of folks with here with children. Okay, what did you do with your kid when they were 5? Preschool. They went to preschool. They went to kindergarten. What did you do with them when they were 3? Preschool. Did you take them to work? Sometimes you had to, sometimes you didn't. Some of them may have stayed home with mom and dad. How many of you are watching the grandkids occasionally? Because childcare closed? Or because the kid's sick and they can't go to childcare? Or COVID broke out at school and now they can't go to school? Did any of you help during the pandemic with kids and grandkids because parents were still trying to work and manage? That was, during the pandemic was one of those times that folks went, oh my God, teachers do a lot. And it feels to me though, like the past couple of years, everybody's forgotten how hard it was to have all those kids at home. These kids in this birth through age 8 years, it's not appropriate to leave them home alone. You don't leave that 3-year-old at home alone. You don't leave that infant home alone if you're working. And one of the things we know in Nebraska, and I've got some numbers later, is that most Nebraskans work. So these kids can't stay at home. And this is true in rural communities and in farm families. Parents are working. So these kids have to be somewhere. And that's where early care and education becomes important, because whoever it is that's there with those kids becomes a really key figure in that child's life. And we do know that it's hard for parents. 31% of parents left the workforce because they couldn't find childcare. Now, in a state where we have 64,000 open jobs, that's a lot of people leaving the workforce. Okay, this came out yesterday in UNL Today. I stole it right off of their webpage. So if you read UNL Today, the most recent rural poll came out, and even in rural Nebraska, we're finding the same thing. Folks say there is a lack of childcare. They can't find affordable childcare, and they need more options. They also need before and after school options. So that often applies to those kids in that 9 up into high school age. School ends 3, 4 o'clock. When do you get off work? Probably not at that time, or you have to have a really flexible schedule. Yeah. So most faculty, it's okay. I could take off, I could go get my daughter after school and then finish up my grading and do some calls and do my email and do those things. Most people don't have that kind of flexibility. We're a fairly privileged group working at the university to have some of that flexibility. So this is a problem across the state in terms of where are these kids going. So I want to spend just a minute or two and talk to you a little bit about the brain. Now, some of you may know this because we're seeing more and more of this about children and children's brains and why these individuals caring for kids, why parents are so important for these kids. When you're born, we used to think you were born with all the neurons you were ever going to have. Well, no, it's not quite true. We actually develop more neurons in adulthood. But what we really develop as we're growing is we develop connections between those neurons. So what you see on the far side is a neonate and 1 month. And these are individual neurons, and you're seeing the connections start to form from them. And if you remember your biology, a connection between neurons is basically learning. And once you learn something and you make those connections, it's much easier to access it. Now, there's lots more details in there, but we won't go into all those details. But what you can see, as the age goes up in months, you're getting more and more connections between those neurons. The brain architecture, the actual brain, is growing in that child. And we know that the most growth occurs in these early years. How many of you know a second language? Is it a couple? Okay, I'm surprised it's not me. Okay. A second language. Do you know a second language? Okay. Do you know a second language? How many people know a second language? A little? Okay. Did you learn it as an adult? Was it hard? Okay. Do the same thing with a 3-year-old. They will learn a second language in a year. At least a lot of it. Because of the neurons and those synapses. It is much easier to learn new things when you're young. We're getting a little older now. It's a lot harder for us to learn these new things. You have to repeat it over and over. You got to practice it again and again and again. And then you go and you say that one ugly word to your grandchild. They use it immediately, don't they? Right away, they're running to mom saying, guess what grandma said? Okay? Because in this young age, the brain can change so quickly. It's so plastic, they can learn so well. So all of these people taking care of these kids in this early years are having a huge impact. They are literally changing how the brain is formed and how the change works. They're truly brain builders. One of the other things that we've been finding in some of the recent research that's really been coming out in the past 10 and 15 years is that trauma in the early years has a really big impact on kids. And you may have heard of what they call adverse childhood experiences. And these are things that often happen to kids in the early years. They have them in a variety of categories here. This is actually from the Centers for Disease Control and how they categorize them. You know, things like abuse, emotional, physical abuse is obviously a trauma. But there's also things like divorce, neglect, is a category in here. Community violence, if you're growing up in a community where there's lots of violence, there's gunshots around all the time, you don't feel secure, that's considered trauma, especially for young children. And one of the things we know about these ACEs is that the more of them you have, the more impact it can have, especially long term. So they accumulate over time, and they're associated with things like re-victimization. So if you were sexually abused as a child, you are more likely to be in an abusive situation as an adult. And there's lots of reasons for that. But some of it is because of this trauma and that early brain development that happens with that trauma. These are some numbers from Nebraska. And 16% of children who have experienced ACEs have 2 or more ACEs. And that means they are much more likely to act out in school, to have obesity problems, some kind of behavior problems. They're more likely to fail at school. They're more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. All those things that we do not want for our children. The more ACEs there are, the more likely you're going to see those things related to them. There. So this is just this is kind of how the ACEs develop over time. So you may have heard of the folks talk about this as toxic stress. So when a child experiences something over and over, that's toxic stress. So if you're living in a dangerous neighborhood for the first 10 years of your life, that's toxic stress. Your parents get divorced, then you move, then mom loses her job, then you move again, and then you change schools within the same district. All of those events add up in children, and what happens is it affects your body. So think about when you've been really stressed. Does your stomach hurt? You get a headache? You feel achy? That's the stress in your body. And they've actually done a really good job now in terms of mapping how these things work. If you really want to get into some of the history, a great book is The Body Keeps the Score. And it talks the impact of stress on the body and basically how your body remembers trauma and stress and how that mind-body connection works. I'm reading it now. It's really great. Okay. So these things are hard for our kids. One of the things we also know is the best way to help children who are exposed to these ACEs is to have a warm, loving caregiver present. That can be a parent, it can be a grandparent, and very often it's the early childhood teacher. Because in a lot of families, some children are in childcare or school more than they are at home. So that adult who's there with them day after day makes a huge difference because they can protect against things like ACEs and that long-term impact of what's going on, and because they can understand what's happening with that. Okay? So the caregiver, the teacher, a teacher like this who is obviously really happy to be interacting with this baby. She's making eye contact with the child. She's engaging with the child. That is the sort of interaction that really helps young kids. They feel loved, they feel warm, and it protects them against these things that are happening in their environment that can impact them negatively. I'm not going to delve deep into this, but I wanted to put this up. It's one of the first things I did when I took this job. The early childhood workforce is really diverse. So when we think about who it is, it's that center director and that center teacher in your community who's working with those 2- and 3-year-olds in the toddler classroom. It's that teacher in the school in the public pre-K classroom working with the 4- and 5-year-olds. It's that 2nd and 3rd grade teacher. It's that in-home provider who's caring for an infant, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, and at the end of the day, she has 3 middle schoolers come in. All of those we consider part of the early childhood workforce, and all of them have impacts on those kids. So my job is to make sure these guys can do their job. So here's some scary numbers for you. 74% of Nebraska voters, this is a recent survey sponsored by Extension in the We Care for Kids campaign, said that lack of quality, affordable childcare in their community is a serious problem. Parents can't find what they consider quality, affordable childcare. First Five Nebraska did a report called The Bottom Line. They say because of lack of childcare, the state's losing $745 million a year. What's the budget deficit this year for UNL? Was it 12 million they're cutting? 77% of America's youth can't qualify for military service. Do you know the main reason? Obesity. One of the best ways to fix obesity, you instill good exercise and nutrition habits in preschoolers and kids as they go through elementary school. The first thing we cut out of schools, recess. Nebraska only has 54 workers for every 100 jobs. We can't fill the jobs we have open. There's 64,000 job openings in Nebraska. We don't even have enough people to fill the jobs if we had enough childcare for those parents to go to work. And we can't afford to lose people in Nebraska. The brain drain is real, and we can't afford to lose it. And why do you choose a new community? You go because there's a good job. But when you go because there's a good job, you want a nice place to live, and you want to know where your kids are going to go to school and where they're going to go to childcare. Housing is the next big thing on the list. Well, housing and childcare are the 2 big things on the list for most communities in terms of this is where we need to invest so we can attract people to our communities. And when you're in rural communities, you find it's even a bigger problem. Rural schools are having lots of trouble finding teachers because they don't have any place to house them. It's even worse when you start talking about student teachers. Student teachers don't want to go to rural communities because they don't have a place to live. And most of the time they're not getting any money. And so how are they going to pay rent anyway? You have to go to a place where you can live with someone you know. I was in an educator shortage summit in Kearney a couple of weeks ago, and housing for student teachers and stipends and payments for student teachers was one of the big things they were talking about, because they could not attract student teachers to the rural communities. This is just a couple more of interesting things. 92% of Nebraskans thinks child care is important for the economy. This is the same extension study. So when you go out and you talk to Nebraskans, they say, yes, it's important. Where we seem to be finding a disconnect, though, is how people vote and how they talk to the unicameral, how they talk to their school boards. It's not just, yeah, we care about it when you answer the survey. It's that next step of you call your state senator and you say, hey, I saw you had all that money from the ARPA and pandemic. Why did you put it here instead of here? Early childhood lost out with the pandemic funds. Some amazing things were done for money that came down that was specifically for child care, but the general funds that came to the state, virtually none of it went towards child care and early childhood in any way. Very little of it went to education. What went to education was directly for education. Okay, questions? What do you want to know?
Has the pay for child care workers come up?
No. The average pay for someone in a center-based setting is just about the poverty level. It's usually within $2,000 or $3,000 of the poverty level. If you are in a school district, if you are in a pre-K classroom, you tend to be on the district salary schedule. So you're making much closer to what we would call a living wage. But we also know the younger of the age you teach, the less your paycheck is. A kindergarten teacher tends to make much less than a high school teacher.
Are there any states that are providing state funds just to supplement child care workers' salaries?
Yes. Yes, it has come in some place. Washington, D.C. is actually the best example. Washington, D.C. Actually sent out $10,000 checks to its child care workforce in the past couple of years to get them up to pay, and now they're putting in funds to make sure that they stay at a sustainable pay level. A couple of other states have tried some things. Tax credits, a lot of states seem to be trying tax credits now. Nebraska's doing the tax credit option.
There we go. Susan, the caregivers who are working with pre-K, are there requirements for their own education at a level that we can talk about?
Yes. Yeah, that's one of the other really interesting things about the early childhood workforce. If you're in this green side, if you're working with a school, you're required to have a teacher certificate. You have to have a teaching certificate. So you're going through higher education, you have your bachelor's, and you have a teaching license. If you're in a pre-K classroom, you're required to have an early childhood endorsement. And if you know anything about endorsements, there's lots of different ways you can kind of configure that in terms of how you put that together. But you have to have specific content in early childhood. If you are in a center-based setting, which tends to be community settings or home-based settings, you are only under the rules of Health and Human Services licensing. There's a little bit of flexibility, but minimum is a GED and 12 hours of training. So you can have a teacher working with a 4-year-old with a high school diploma in a community-based setting, or a teacher with a teaching license and a bachelor's in a pre-K setting. Both have the same job, working with 4-year-olds, very different requirements and very different pay scales. And they're reporting to very different people. We call it a mixed delivery system. It's a nice way to say it.
What are some innovative ways that you've seen in your studies that people are addressing this problem across the country?
It's a really good question. There are some really nice innovations that are going on, and Nebraska's actually doing really well. We're ahead of a lot of states. We're behind a few. One of the things that a lot of folks are working on is actually that kind of licensing qualifications. How do we make sure that all of these folks have the skills that they need to do what they need to do? because getting that bachelor's degree is very different from just having that high school diploma. But then we also have folks who have been in the field for 30 years, and they really know what they're doing, but we have absolutely no way to say they're delivering quality care. So Nebraska is actually starting to move, looking at a competency-based system. How can we actually say that 30-year-old professional has those skills? Some states have been moving that way already. They're upping requirements through licensing to say you have to have more than a GED. You have to have an associate's degree or more. So we're seeing some states increasing that. We're seeing ways where states are trying to put more funding in the system so that folks can actually be in the system and earn a living wage. As a faculty member, it's actually an ethical dilemma in early childhood when you have a new student that comes to you and says, yes, I really want to be in this field, I'm so excited, and then you start talking to them, and they're going to be poor. They're not going to make any money. How do you advise someone into a field where they're going to make $30,000 and $40,000 a year, and they may have that much money in student loans? Those are some of the things that are going on. Pathways to become an early childhood educator. How do you get there? That's another innovation. Nebraska is currently working to try and develop apprenticeships in early childhood. So drawing on the career technical ed field to do some apprenticeship type things so you can work on the job, get paid, and get an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree while you're doing that. So those are some of the things that are happening. In terms of pay, tax credits have, several states are now going through the kind of the tax credit door. If you're in early childhood, they'll give you a refundable tax credit. Nebraska's taken that route. Some states, or like Washington, D.C., Oregon, Washington State, are actually increasing base pay of early childhood educators, so they're using some state funds to do that. During the pandemic, a lot of the funds were used as bonuses and stipends for the early childhood field because we had to keep those folks working, because when childcare closed and school closed, those kids had nowhere to go. So there were a lot of stipends and bonuses that were done with the pandemic money. The pandemic money was also used by a lot of states just to open new places and get them going. One of the things that's really hard to do is open a new childcare center or home, because there's a lot of physical requirements in terms of the physical setting. So it's a lot of upfront investment, and you can't find much money for that. So some of those things have been some of the more innovative things that are going on.
Can you help us know, has there been any recent research about the benefits or the problems that are caused by the recent large numbers of parents who chose to work from home? Has that change in the workforce impacted childcare? Even though we're finding more parents working from home, it's starting to shift now. People seem to be going back to the office. And if you read the news, Governor Pillen just said all state workers have to go back to the office. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know if the research that has actually looked at it, but what we do know from anecdotal stories and from some of the things that are out there, even if a parent is working at home, they often want access to childcare, because sometimes it's really hard to work at home when you've got a toddler running around. There's some great YouTube videos now of kids interrupting, your video calls and do that. So you often still need childcare. There are some employers that require you to have childcare if you work at home. So you don't have that flexibility. One of the things we are hearing across the nation is that as kids are going back to school, and especially in those kindergarten, first grade classrooms, there are lots more behavior problems. We don't know for sure, but it could be because those kids were not in those childcare settings. They weren't getting the socialization. They weren't getting the teaching from one of the things you learn in childcare and preschool is how to get along with your peers. If you're at home alone, it's really hard to learn how to get along with your peers. And getting along with your sibling is very different than getting along with your peers. So we're seeing lots of behavior problems. Teachers are asking and asking for help in terms of dealing with that. So it's kind of a sideway answer to your question.
So does your group work with organizations, companies to try and get childcare facilities within the organization?
We don't do that specifically, but we'll refer them to the folks that can help them do it. There have been some really successful things in terms of doing that, where a company will do an on-site childcare. One of the options that I encourage when I get calls is, if you don't want to put the investment into your own childcare, is buy childcare spots. So you work with a local community provider and you guarantee a spot for your employees' children in that setting. One of the difficulties in balancing the books in childcare is that you don't know how many kids you're going to have. And if you take subsidy, which is, if parents at a low income level can get some money from the state, child care subsidy, to help pay their child care bill, you only get that subsidy payment if the child shows up. And so you don't know from week to week how many kids you're going to have. And depending on how you write your contract with what we call the private pay parents who are paying the full tuition, if you say they have to pay whether or not their kid's there, you're guaranteed that income. But if the parent only pays when their child's there, you've got a lot of ups and downs. And it's very hard to predict. And parents don't want to pay when their kids don't go. But we don't do that in public schools. You pay your school taxes whether or not your child is attending.
Question, sort of three parts. Can you say a little more about the Buffett Early Childhood Institute and your program's relationship with it? And most important, are we ranked high because it exists?
Oh, well, of course we are ranked high because the Buffett Institute exists. Of course, of course. The Buffett Early Childhood Institute is considered part of the university system. So my boss, Walter Gilliam, who's our new executive director, reports directly to President Carter, or I guess interim President Koborek soon. So we are considered part of the president's office. But the mandate with the endowment from Susie Buffett was that we were to work across the state and we were to work with all of the campuses. So we reach out across the campuses to work with a lot of the faculty on research and other projects that are going on. We actually have what we call community chairs on 2 campuses right now. So there are faculty members that are affiliated with us, and they have some of their time with us, and the rest of the time is with their home department. So Julie Turquati is the community chair here in Lincoln, and Marisa Macy is our community chair in Kearney. We had one at UNMC, and that just expired, and we've had trouble hiring at UNO for some reason. But the idea was to have one on each campus. In terms of how Nebraska is seen in early childhood, I think the Institute helps in terms of attention to Nebraska. But Nebraska has always been kind of at the forefront of a lot of early childhood things. We've had a lot of forward-looking people in early childhood in the university and at the state level in Nebraska for a very long time. So this is my 25th year here. Can you believe it, Julie? 25 years. My former boss is sitting back here. 25 years now at Nebraska. And when I came, there was already pretty big emphasis, especially here on the UNL campus in early childhood. There's a lot of good research that goes on here at UNL.
Is there any of the candidates at the federal level in Washington running for president, that has said anything about child care?
President Biden has, is the only one I've heard. He had the Build Back Better bill was almost passed, and it would have put a large amount of money in early childhood, especially for 4-year-olds. So it would have been, the idea was it would have made programs like Head Start and pre-K available for all 4-year-olds and possibly 3-year-olds in all states. So it was putting a substantial amount of money in. It did not pass, and it didn't make it through. There are lots of things were going on after the pandemic in terms of that. There's another bill that they're working on now where they're trying to increase some funding. Head Start did get an increase in this last appropriations bill, so Head Start is considered part of the early childhood field. Head Start funding comes directly from the feds to an organization in a state, so a community action program. Sometimes it's a school district, and Head Start and Early Head Start serves very specific children. They're great programs. They tend to offer lots of other services that you're not necessarily going to get in a community-based child care, but they're only serving a fraction of the children that they could. I have not heard anything specific on the Republican side so far. It does tend to come up. Senator Fisher has been expressing some more interest in early childhood now, and the university has been working with her for an earmark that could go to the University of Nebraska Kearney to Marisa Macy, specifically in early childhood. So we're hoping that that signals some more interest there from our federal delegation. In the state unicameral, it's very mixed.
Susan, with the shortage we have in Nebraska in terms of the workforce, you'd think that corporations would be doing a lot to provide on-site childcare. Is that happening at all?
It is happening some. It's still infrequent because of the cost. Once you actually look what it takes to run a childcare business, most companies don't want to put in the funds. But if you start looking at the cost and benefits and the benefits you get back in terms of employee retention and employee attendance and productivity, it's well worth it. We know if you have on-site childcare, your employees are more likely to come to work. They're more likely to stay at work all day, and they are less stressed because they know their child is safe. One of the things when you survey parents that they worry about most is their children during the day, whether they're at school or in childcare. So if you can reassure them that their child is doing well, they're going to focus on their work. So there have been some examples. The hospital in York realized that it had a huge shortage of nurses. And one of the reasons they couldn't attract nurses because they could not find childcare, especially for their infants in second and third shifts. So they worked with a local home provider who has established childcare within the hospital setting. And so the nurses come to work, they can drop off their kids, they go to work. If they're nursing, they can go down and nurse their child, go back to work. They have now found that they are attracting more nurses, and the nurses they are attracting are staying. So it definitely works once you can convince the company that it's valuable.
And Susan, to your knowledge, has any state developed a program where they help corporations fund childcare on-site?
Not that I know of. A lot of the pandemic funds were used to kind of create some new systems, but it usually was oriented at a childcare owner who could then connect possibly with a business. But it usually was coming from an individual in the community that then approaches the business and say, hey, let's do this. It doesn't seem to come from the business approaching childcare. That's a good question. I have to look and see if there's more funds.
Susan, does the licensing requirements have anything to do with continuing education once they're hired and once they're licensed?
No, once you are licensed in a community-based setting or an in-home setting, you're required to do 13 hours a year of continuous learning or credit. And that professional development that they do every year is not connected to courses. And that's one of the things we're really looking at in Nebraska. Extension does some amazing professional development in early childhood. And, you know, if you go through 13 hours of professional development with an extension educator, you're learning some good stuff. We know because we have great extension educators. How do we connect that to actual coursework so then they enroll at UNL or UNK or UNO? So we're trying to think of some of those ideas. How do you make those connections? But licensing requirements only require the hours.
You mentioned, I think, that the situation in rural areas is worse than it is in non-rural areas. Are there any specific efforts targeted toward rural areas to improve that situation?
There are quite a few things. One of the really innovative things that Nebraska has is a program called Communities for Kids. It's run out of the Nebraska Children and Families Foundation, NCFF. And Communities for Kids uses some federal money and some state money, and sometimes they'll use local funds. And communities apply, and then they have kind of a TA system that helps them decide what that community needs. And so the community may say, well, we know we don't have enough childcare here. They apply for the Community for Kids grants, and then they pull a team together in a community to say, well, we need a new center. We have enough kids, we can support a center. Or wait, we don't actually have enough kids to keep a center open. Maybe we just need 2 home providers. And then they figure out how to fund and do that. They've done some very innovative things. There's several communities in Nebraska that have built and opened brand new centers with Communities for Kids. Columbus is getting ready to do one. They're pulling funds from 10 or 12 different places, and they have their Chamber of Commerce on board, which has really helped them. So they're getting donations from the Chamber of Commerce, and someone from the Chamber of Commerce has been helping them actually do the accounting and the funding part, which is really important. Yeah, so there are some things like that. But Communities for Kids, they're in 50-some communities now across the state.
Hey, thanks for your work that you're doing. Have you had an opportunity to look at some of those communities that have lots of students or preschool students from the meat packing plants, like Lexington and Norfolk, Grand Island?
Yeah, Lexington, Grand Island, Columbus, those. Communities for Kids just has hired several bilingual consultants now, and the state is actually adding some bilingual licensing specialists and folks who work with the Step Up to Quality system, which is our quality rating system, are adding bilingual people to their payrolls so that they can work more closely in those communities. What you usually find is a lot of those children will be going to what we call family, friend, and neighbor care, or kith and kin care. On my slide before, it's grayed out a little bit on here because we had to make a decision about where are we focusing our efforts, and we decided that we're going to focus on the paid early childhood workforce. Family, friend, and neighbor care is kind of its own entity in terms of how you do that. I mean, how do you tell grandma that she needs to have an associate's degree to take care of her grandkids? You know, she may be taking care of 3 or 4 grandkids, but it's really hard to tell her you have to go get your associate's degree. So it's kind of, but there are some states and there are a couple of innovative programs that reach out to that community in terms of, yeah, grandma, it's great you're doing this, but let's not set them in front of the TV.
Other questions? Susan, I have a question about, in another life, I was a superintendent of schools. And in our school district, we were amazed to find out we had a 22% mobility rate among our parents. So when rent came due, most people in that category moved. So our Head Start program was full. Any idea about the mobility rate among Nebraska communities or in Nebraska communities? We thought that was pretty high, but I would guess Omaha and...
Yeah, probably Omaha and Lincoln have a much higher mobility rate than the rural areas. I'm not sure on that. I haven't looked at those rates.
Other questions?
There are 225 pre-K programs in Nebraska. I did look it up. It's just about 90-95% of school districts have a public pre-K program. Some are half-day. There's not a requirement to be full-day. Some are half-day.
About 15 years ago, a graduate student of Carolyn Edwards shared with me some research that said the knowledge gap that exists on day 1 of kindergarten was still visible in high school in some disciplines. So could you comment about the importance of early childhood learning from the point of view of reducing inequities in education?
Yes, and that's very true. Once you start out behind in kindergarten, you tend to stay behind in kindergarten. A lot of folks used to talk about the fade-out effect in early childhood, especially early studies on Head Start. When you would follow Head Start kids who had gone to Head Start and those who hadn't, they'd hit kindergarten and they'd be at the same level, and then you would find by the time they got to 3rd grade, those Head Start kids were not performing quite as well as their peers, and they called it the fade-out effect. What we now know is it's not Head Start's fault. If I give you a plant and you kill it, it's not my fault. It was healthy when I gave it to you. Now, I'm not saying public schools are killing our kids, okay? But, you know, if the child is doing well and they enter your setting and then they don't stay at that level, something's going on in the system that's not helping that child. And so we can do a lot of stuff in early childhood to get them where they need to be when they hit the school system, but the school systems have to pick it up and keep it going. And we do know there are very long-term effects in terms of either that gap widening or, not getting there at all. There's a lot of language learning that suggests there's a big difference in terms of the amount of language you learn. If you are with a high-quality early childhood teacher, you're hearing lots more words and you're hearing lots more complicated words than you're with someone who doesn't have an education and background or who doesn't think it's important to talk to kids. That kind of get...
I'm not really sure how to formulate this question, but there's a big difference between daycare and preschool. And I know because I was in the system in those areas. Does your certification stuff slant more toward preschool?
One of the things I like to talk about is that all care is learning. When you're talking about kids, infants, toddlers, those 3, 4-year-olds, every time you're with that child, they're learning something. It may be more explicit teaching, or it may be they're just watching you how you use your phone, and they're learning to use your phone. So in that sense, there really isn't much of a difference between daycare and preschool. The kids are learning. We like to use child care or early care and education to emphasize the fact that there's learning going on. And a lot of early childhood providers will say, I don't care for days, I care for kids. So let's talk about the kids. Because of this mixed delivery system, though, we tend to get in that. The quality and how you determine the quality in those settings that aren't in school is much harder to determine. In schools, we have a set of rules, we have accreditation, we have folks that come in and visit. Licensing does visit childcare. But it's a minimal set of requirements, and it's focused mostly on health and safety. Are you clean? Are the kids safe? There's nothing the kids can choke on. There's very little in terms of what we think of as quality. We define quality as those engaging, warm, language-rich interactions with the child. So it's a definition of quality based on the child. What is the child experiencing? And if they're experiencing quality with that caregiver, then it's a quality setting.
Okay. Any last questions? Yes. Kim.
I know people hate the last questioner. Can you say something that makes us feel hopeful?
There you go, there you go. I would say it's this. 92% of Nebraskans think this is important. And it's just a matter of telling everybody else it is important and we can do this. Nebraska really is doing a lot. We just need a little bit more to keep going that way. We need a little more political support and will. Money, of course, is always an issue. I've been saying lately, this is one of those problems you can throw money at. You really can. You give us the money, we know where to invest it and how to invest it, and we can make it even better. So this is one that you can do that. I did bring some handouts with me. One of the things that's going on, there's this campaign, We Care for Kids. It's funded through some private donations and some federal dollars right now. And it's basically a campaign across Nebraska to say, this is important. Quality care and education is important. And this one little sheet is just a couple of things you can do for Nebraska's kids right now. And it's some of these ideas, like talking to your family, friends, and neighbors, calling your state senator. One of the things we know about Nebraska is one of you probably lives really close, or you know one of your state senators. You grew up with them, or you know somebody who grew up with them, and those are the people they listen to. And so when you go and knock on their door and you say, hey, what are you doing about this? They pay attention. So those sort of things. So I did bring a couple of things from the We Care for Kids campaign. They also have a really good website that can give you access, that you can go there for more resource, and the Buffett Institute website can also give you some more resource.